And yeah, thank you so much for participating in today's webinar where we'll be talking about the solar industry and climate change. So I'll start by introducing our panelists today. Cindy Nguyen is a Ray Clean Energy Fellow with RMI's Global South program, where she works with national climate offices, government stakeholders, and utilities to develop clean energy pathways and build resilience in the Caribbean and Southeast Asia. As a Ray Fellow, she aims to champion diverse and underrepresented voices in environmental work and center equity and justice within the clean energy sector. Welcome, Cindy. Our next panelist is Dakota Pekerti, who is the Global Design Platform Product Manager for the Hanwha Qcells North America, where he manages the development of the company's global design platform, which allows customers and internal users to model behind the meter solar and energy storage projects in both domestic and international markets. Dakota was previously a 2021 Clean Energy Leadership Institute Fellow and Board Director and Community Engagement Lead for the Conference of Asian Pacific American Leadership, a nonprofit where he worked to build a pipeline for NHPIs in public service. Dakota graduated from Swarthmore College with a BS in engineering. Moving on to, and welcome to Dakota. Moving on to Anna. Anna Toenjes leads Soul Customer Solutions, originating efforts in a variety of markets where she works to source and develop commercial and small utility scale battery storage and solar projects for customers. Since 2011, she's cultivated relationships with over 300 developers and EPC firms, sourced over 750 projects, and successfully closed over 50 megawatts through both project acquisition and debt financing, and successfully originated an additional 20 projects totaling $105 million. The vast majority of her origination and project development work has been focused on public power customers. Ms. Toenjes has presented at some of the industry's largest conferences, including Solar Power International and Solar Power Northeast. Additionally, she is a recurring contributor to Soul Systems blog and monthly industry publication, The Soul Source. And that's our panel. Now, if you have any questions at any point in the webinar, feel free to leave them in the Q&A feature, and we will ask audience questions after the initial panel. But for now, let's get started. So let's get started, and feel free to answer however you see fit. Whoever wants to go first, what motivated you all to pursue work related to or in the solar industry?
I'm happy to go first. Was the first one to get off mute. Thanks everyone for joining. This is super exciting and glad to be a part of this. I would say my motivation to do this work probably started from when I was pretty young and just growing up in a house that was sustainably minded and always sort of talked about climate change as something that, you know, was an issue to address and probably was going to be, you know, a big issue impacting our future. You know, 20, 30 years ago, it wasn't as, you know, big of an issue as it is today. But I always sort of kept that in the back of my mind as I was thinking about college and pursuing a career, you know, that it would be pretty awesome to do something in the climate space. And so for me, it really started from when I was really young, but then I would say that transitioned to attending college. I went to Bowdoin College up in Maine and ended up majoring in government and legal studies and environmental studies. And through those environmental studies courses, I really started to learn more and more about the issue, about renewables in general, and, you know, the industries and opportunities that could result in a career. And I think that helped to guide me in a way and further motivate me to have my job and my career be related to combating climate change. I was originally very policy focused and policy minded. So when I graduated from Bowdoin, I went down to Capitol Hill and interned for Senator Snow from Maine. And it was an awesome opportunity. I think because of my policy background, that sort of felt like the best avenue to be able to pursue and, you know, follow through on the motivations that I had and make an impact. But I pretty quickly realized that federal policy is not where things happen really quickly. And I wanted personally to be making an impact as much as I could really in my day-to-day and start to see, real things happen and projects being built and, be a part of making that happen. And so from there, I transitioned to the private sector and found Soul Systems, where I've been working for the last almost 11 years. And being at a company like Soul, where you see the steel go into the ground, we're funding projects that are being built and helping customers go solar, is frankly my continued motivation to be a part of this industry, is to, see those small improvements happening project by project, can be really impactful, and definitely is a huge part of the reason why I've stayed in the industry for so long too.
I'm happy to go next. Thank you, Anna, for sharing. I've sort of a similar path to you, but like Anna, I also study policy. I actually went to Colby College, so we might have a bit of a rivalry there. But I studied environmental policy at Colby, and throughout all of my time, especially as a woman of color, a lot of my work was focused on environmental justice advocacy, community-based advocacy. I did a little bit of work in the international realm as well. I studied abroad in Vietnam and Sri Lanka, studying issues of sustainable development. So that kind of piqued my interest in kind of international climate policy, but also international environmental policy writ large. And so similar to Anna, I didn't go into college pursuing a career in energy or even specifically solar. I actually came to my job at RMI through what's called the RAY Clean Energy Fellowship, which is a fellowship aimed to get individuals of color into conservation and clean energy workforces. And so they pair us with different nonprofits. And so that's how I came to RMI, but I specifically work within the Global South program and specifically in the Caribbean. And it's been a really incredible experience because even though, equity, I would say, is definitely in the center of our work in energy. And I never thought that before, prior to working in the clean energy industry, I definitely was like, oh, everyone in energy is just kind of like into their quant modeling and like talking about numbers and like making the market case, like where's the human aspect to it? But after working at RMI for a couple of years now, I'm realizing that's totally not the case. It's a very, very people-centered field because essentially what you're trying to do is get people access to clean, affordable, and reliant energy, right? As we've seen with kind of the energy landscape recently with different world conflicts. And so for me, what really drew me to the work and what keeps me in the work is the ability to kind of promote values of environmental justice and equity and build resilience. I think energy is a really important thing, especially for countries that are more vulnerable to climate change, such as the countries I work with in Caribbean states specifically. Energy is a way for them to build their own security and build independence by finding their own domestic power source, but also resilience to the different climatic impacts that we're seeing. And I think also the biggest thing for me, at least, that really drives a lot of the work that I do is just recognizing that it's really important for vulnerable countries who've had histories of extraction, colonialism, things like that, to chart their own climate and development pathways. And energy plays a really huge and critical role in ensuring that, countries are able to move forward in the future. So I'll stop there, but that's definitely what motivated me to join. So passing it to Dakota.
Oh, thanks, Cindy. And just to round things out, I also have a somewhat similar background, but also slightly different. As a person of color, my parents were actually Indonesian immigrants who moved to Texas before they had me. And I think the way I came to the solar industry is it's definitely a multi-step process, but it did start when I was young. I grew up in Texas when fracking was just starting to become a big thing. So our neighborhood actually, I think before I got there, signed a contract to allow them to frack underneath their neighborhood, which obviously carries a lot of, different implications with it, including, sometimes that water occasionally turning brown, not as bad as like say Flint, but it was there and it's something that I remember as a child. But also, I think as the child of immigrants, I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to visit Indonesia with my parents. And so my dad is from Jakarta, my mother's from Bali, very different places. Like one completely urbanized, probably, you know, quote unquote peak development, but also very, I think, environmentally unfriendly, like tons of air pollution, you know, tons of income inequality between like the slums and the huge high rises. And then Bali is the complete opposite of that, where it's very, you know, it's curated definitely for a tourist aesthetic, but the whole historical mindset of Bali is that, you know, it is a more sustainably managed place, and the locals do and care a lot about, you know, living in a sustainable way that keeps the island and its environmental resources like, you know, in check. And so kind of bouncing between all three of these different worlds, I kind of piece together this understanding of like environmental injustice, you know, the kind of source of energy and how it comes to be in our daily lives. And I think by the time I hit high school, you know, I knew what solar energy was, and the technology was starting to get a lot of press at the time. And I kind of jumped right in. I'm like, okay, if this is the way for, you know, places in the US or places anywhere around the world really to avoid becoming kind of like places like Jakarta, which are not, you know, the most livable or, you know, the most well supplied environmentally, like, you know, how can I make that happen? And I think I definitely approached it from more of a technical perspective, because that was what I enjoyed. I just enjoyed designing and building things as a child, and then that kind of followed me up through college. And I think, you know, I was definitely pursuing environmental sustainability from a broader lens when I entered college, but it really narrowed when I went to the, you know, Conference of Parties 21 in Paris, where they signed the Paris agreement. And, you know, just kind of talking with all the different stakeholders there from all these different countries, I realized like energy was the place to be if you wanted to make a real change in climate change. And it just underpins so many other industries, movements, initiatives that I feel like it was the place that I could have the most impact. And so graduating from Swarthmore, I took a bit of a roundabout path to get there, but I ended up in an industry or segment of the energy industry, energy storage, which, you know, when paired with solar really helps push forward that narrative. And I think, you know, if you know about how renewables work, solar and wind are intermittent, so you need somewhere to put them in the time when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. And, you know, that was where I wanted to be, and where all the innovation, I think, is happening in the technology space right now. So yeah, that's how I came to be in and around the solar industry.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear everyone's background. You know, Anna and Cindy, you both talked about coming into the solar industry through policy. And, you know, Dakota, thank you so much for bringing in your lived experience, you know, or, you know, your understanding of like how solar can play a role in mitigating a lot of environmental issues. And, you know, us at the climate industry, or us at the climate initiative, we acknowledge that solar tech is important in and plays an integral role in stopping the climate crisis. So the next question I have for you all, and since we started with Anna first, we can go on to Dakota first, if he doesn't mind. I was wondering, does the climate crisis come up regularly in your work? If so, in what ways? And if not, why do you think it does not?
Yeah, so this is a great question, one I'm excited to answer, because I think similar to Cindy and Anna to some degree, like when I think of solar tech or just tech in general, you think of tech bros, which is a completely different mindset than, you know, and maybe not as focused on climate change as hopefully our own industry, or, you know, the energy industry is. And I think I'm super fortunate to be working at a company with a group of people where climate change is like the real priority, right? Like everyone that I work with, when you talk to them, will state that the reason they joined is to kind of help in the fight against climate change. And, you know, with a similar skill set and kind of background to my own, this is where they saw themselves making the most impact. And so it comes up regularly, not just among the younger employees, but surprisingly the older employees who, you know, maybe there's sometimes a generational gap, but like, you know, the climate crisis is something I'd identify as more squarely urgent in our generation. And yeah, I feel that between the conversations I have with them, sometimes even stepping out to protest in the middle of the days, like with our managers and stuff, the climate crisis is always at the forefront of everyone's mind. And we always try to design solutions and systems that really push the buck foot on that. So, you know, I think we might get to some later questions considering like policy and like different ways in which that work can be pushed in different directions. But, you know, it comes up every day. We literally have like threads specifically dedicated to climate action, like around the world in our locale, different policies. Like my coworkers are also very attuned to like how the local politics and like statewide politics affect like climate change and like how they affect our industry and our impact on that. And yeah, I don't know, it's very surprising, but it's also amazing. Like I somehow ended up in a space where, you know, we kind of get the best of both worlds. And even though we aren't the ones writing the policy, we are very aware of it and very aware of that impact and, you know, what we can do in that push. So yeah, I guess
That's
I should
really
pass
great. That's really great to hear. Thanks, Dakota, for sharing. Cindy, Anna, did you all have to crack at it next?
Yeah, happy to. Although my answer is very, very similar. And so it's kind of cool to hear a similar perspective from another company in the industry. I think one of the things that I've loved about working at Soul Systems is how passionate the people are that we hire about this particular issue. And I think it's seen, as you can see, you know, it applies broadly across the industry as well. I think a lot of the folks that are in the industry are in it and a part of it because they want to make a change and they want to make a difference. I don't think that's unique to our industry in particular, but there is a really large issue that we're facing that we can make a real impact on. And I think that's, even if it's not brought up in, you know, meetings throughout the day, it truly is the common thread and consistent driver for everyone that works at our company to, you know, succeed in the work that we're doing and to make a difference. You know, one other component of that is we have a couple employee resource groups within Soul Systems. One of them is a sustainability group. And so it's a group of our employees that are charged with ensuring that Soul Systems as a company, even though we work in the industry, you know, is sustainably minded and doing what we can as a participant in you know, this issue, are doing everything we can to offset our own emissions and, you know, little things like recycle and compost and all that kind of stuff. And so it's exciting to see that, you know, within our own employees, but then also, you know, within the company's mission as a whole, and combining that with our other employee resource group, which is a justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion group. And those two initiatives can go hand in hand, you know, most of the time as well. And so knowing that our company, you know, more broadly, our mission and, you know, our day-to-day work is focused on doing everything we can to stop the climate crisis, but there's also sort of like an inward facing part of it too, for employees to be able to act and ensure that our company itself is held accountable for doing what we can and not be, you know, contributing as much to the climate crisis.
I guess I'll jump in here now. Thank you, Dakota and Anna, for sharing. And yeah, this is a super important question. I think from my perspective as someone who works in the Caribbean and just at RMI, which is technically an energy think tank, but we're much more into the climate space now. It's like we can't even ignore climate at all because it's the only thing that drives, not the only thing, but, you know, one of the biggest things that drives the sense of urgency in our work across the Institute. All of our projects and teams are focused on, you know, that kind of 1.5 C degree threshold. Like we're like racing against the clock, and specifically in the island context, the Caribbean island context, that is, like climate change is one of the biggest threats to the people living there. There's 40 million people within the Caribbean who are considered on the front lines of climate change. And just for a definition, the front lines of climate change are the communities that are being directly impacted today by what we consider, you know, climate driven events such as natural disasters, storm events, other types of climatic events, I guess. And so I would say, yeah, climate is constantly on the front of our brains within the islands team. And I think the way it shows up the most is just understanding, like, in terms of like the climate and energy connection, is how vulnerable islanded energy systems are to climate change. So just to give a brief example, for in 2017, when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, I think it destroyed at least 80% of the island's transmission and distribution line, and that just led to people not having power and therefore not having access to critical services or facilities for a very long time, at least a year, if anything, if I'm getting the timeline right. And so across the islands, it's a very similar story. You know, the model that we have of centralized generation, where you have, like, you know, your big power plant and then a bunch of distribution lines to, like, get people to, or get power to people, doesn't really work on islands, because some island nations are made up of a bunch of different islands, and then some are just geographically constrained, even if they're on one island. It just doesn't work, and that just leaves them so much more vulnerable to climate impacts, because if a major hurricane or storm event were to strike out your central power generation system, then everyone goes without power. So that's just an example of kind of how climate change drives a sense of urgency and purpose to the work that we do here at RMI, specifically within the Global South program and the Islands program. So yeah, climate is all the time. It's, I don't know if I can speak for everyone, but at least for me, it's sometimes hard to, like, shut your brain off from thinking about, like, what can happen and what's going to happen. But the good thing is, you know, solar, renewable energy presents a great path forward for us, and I'm sure we'll get into that.
Well, it sounds like from you all's perspective that the solar industry, the companies, and the energy think tanks are all have the climate crisis on the top of their minds, at least from the places that you all work. Do you all think that that kind of translates to the rest of the industry?
I think so. I would like to say I hope so, honestly. At least a lot of the people that I've networked with and had conversations with, and a lot of the companies that, you know, we do business with and partner with, that's a huge part of our focus is, you know, obviously we're driven by, you know, the bottom line and everything like that. But at the same time, our partnerships that last the longest are the ones that are aligned with us in our mission. And I think, you know, frankly, most companies in this industry and in this business, you know, probably were started because of a motivation around climate. And I think you see that at a lot of the conferences too. I mean, 20 years ago, the conferences were much smaller and it was a different group of people. And you know, maybe folks that were more traditionally environmentalists or things like that. And it's evolved to, you know, bring in different groups of people and different industries. But I think I'd like to think that that core mission and drive is still there for at least most folks and most companies that work in the industry. And if it's not there, then the corporate customers that we work with are going to force it on a lot of us, which I think is an interesting part of the transition and growth of the solar industry that we're seeing right now too. I mean, a lot of the larger companies that we work with, like, you know, the Amazons of the world, are doing everything and anything they can to drive forward and make an impact on combating, you know, this climate issue and crisis that we're facing.
Yeah, if I could add to that point, I would say, you know, in kind of contrast to the big misconception that, like, corporations don't believe in climate change, about, like, they do. They know exactly what it is because they're the ones that created it for the most part. And I would say across the industry, like, everyone understands climate. I think where the division is, and, you know, the nuances, how to tackle it, is what kind of is the big, at least for me, where the big butting head is. You have, like, entities who are, like, thinking, like, you know, technology is going to drive us forward, things like solar, other types of technological innovations, carbon capture, things like that are going to be the things that are going to help us tackle climate change. And then you have kind of the other side of it, if you want to put it into a dichotomy of like people who are more policy minded or people minded who are like, people are actually going to solve us and solve this crisis. And we need to have conversations about dismantling systems and I think it's more complex than that, but I think if just to add another nuance to the conversation, like, yes, everyone gets that climate is the biggest thing. The biggest issue now going forward is how do we want to tackle it, whether we want to work together or whether we want to just kind of do our own thing. I think that's what I see, at least, is kind of the biggest tension point.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks Anna and Cindy for kind of talking us a little bit through about like your perspectives on the industry. I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that there could be these divides on what should be done to, as Cindy mentioned, and I think acknowledging that is the first step to figuring out how to move forward and figuring out how to compromise on those issues. Talking about where solar fits into those climate solutions, we know that solar is important to mitigating the climate crisis, but obviously solar has to be implemented in partnership with a lot of different technologies in order to meaningfully address the climate crisis, because solar does have its limitations. From you all's perspectives, would you be able to talk about what are some of the limitations that the solar industry currently has that prevent it from being expanded faster throughout the world? Or what are some of the limitations that make it not the only, that make it necessary for it to be only one of a part of many solutions to the climate crisis?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one first because I have a very spicy response, which is like, I think the greatest limitation on the solar industry currently is the fossil fuel industry. And I think that's really because the fossil fuel industry gets so much more investment, has almost a chokehold on many sectors of, governments around the world, including our own, which you can kind of see right now. And I really feel that the lack of governments and just, literally any governing body anywhere to kind of hold them accountable with, a proper, just even like a price on the externalities, the negative externalities that they create, really hampers solar. It destroys it forces everyone in the solar industry, for instance, among many other renewable energy industries, to really put in the very honestly difficult work to, fight for scraps of whatever funding is left, fight for, whatever revenue streams, quote unquote, that we can generate from these renewables, and then kind of clash again and again with all these fossil fuel industries and, everyone else that is tied to their funding streams. And it's honestly ridiculous. I could also talk about the technical difficulties of solar, but the fact that's an amendment and such, but I think fossil fuel industry is number one enemy. So I'll leave it there to give Cindy and Anna some room to talk, but I just, Friday afternoon, can't stand the solar industry or the fossil fuel industry, sorry.
Yeah, I think when I wrote that question, I was intending the technical things, but I love this response. Anna, Cindy, feel free to hop in.
Yeah, I thought, Dakota, that you were going to jump right into the technical component and be like, well, it's intermittent and blah, 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 needs to be paired with storage and all that kind of stuff. I was fully ready to jump in and say our biggest limitation is the fact that we have to fight for the ITC every darn year. So I think you said it in a slightly different way, but I appreciate you kicking it off. Because I do think, that is our biggest challenge, is consistency in funding for the industry. And it's there, like the federal investment tax credit has driven this industry to what it is today, but that doesn't mean that it should go away because we've made it, quote unquote, because we haven't. There's still a lot of work to be done. And there are other issues that we face globally, supply chain related, tariffs, there's a ton thrown at our industry that some of it we can't predict. Some of it, it's just, reacting to COVID, to a war, to other things, and it's hitting multiple industries. But because of that, we need that support and consistency to be able to continually build out our industry. And since I joined the solar industry 10, 11 years ago, every couple of years, it's been a fight, and it's only gotten worse. And we'll face another fight, this year to try to extend the 26% ITC. If not, the ITC steps down to 22%. And yes, projects may still be viable, but not in the same way that they would have been otherwise. And we are facing a huge number of issues on the cost side that, are somewhat benefiting us too, because it's raising energy prices across the board. But it still is the biggest battle and biggest limitation is the consistent support from federal funding.
Yeah, I agree with both of you, and I especially agree with Dakota that the fossil fuel industry's chokehold on, energy, just the globe, has prevented so much growth for the solar industry because, I feel like one of the biggest things you hear from people is like, oh my God, solar is so expensive. It's like, it's actually not when you look at the economics of it. The price of solar has fallen dramatically in the last 10 years. And yes, there's obviously certain costs in the short term to get like solar systems built, but in the long term, the economic return of it is so, like, if you care about that stuff, it's just so much more beneficial. But the reason why people don't see it that way is just that consistent messaging from the fossil fuel industry would be like, it's bad, it's not, it's for other interests, and it's blah, 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 all this stuff. And it's that consistent messaging that really prevents it. Another way that kind of the fossil fuel narrative particularly materializes itself within the global south is just this idea that you cannot develop without fossil fuels, which is not true. Like, the work that we do here at RMI is proving that it's not true. Like, yes, there needs to be some sort of energy mix in the interim due to the technical challenges of solar and other types of renewable energy resources, but you can meet your climate and development needs, specifically development needs, with renewable energy. And the reason why that narrative is being pushed is because, the fossil fuel industry is losing its hold, but there's a lot of pushback against it in the United States. So they're looking for ways to ship fuel across the world so that other countries will now become beholden to them too. And I think that's like a really big global dynamic that people need to understand is like, if it's not here, they're just going to convince some other country that they're going to like lock them into these like cheap contracts in which they're just going to import a bunch of fuel, but that's actually going to be very detrimental in the long term. And I think another part of that is, like Anna said, with the funding issue globally, there's just such a lack of financial kind of environment in a lot of global south countries due to the history of colonialism and capitalism. And so there's not private investment specifically on the ground, but also in terms of global climate finance, right? We have this commitment globally to mobilize $100 billion in global climate finance. But the reality is, like, if you've looked at these funding proposals for things like big climate funds, they're so hard to get money. It's so hard to develop projects. There's not enough people on the ground in the global south countries who have the capacity or the expertise necessary to develop project proposals and then gain access to funding. And that's not their fault, obviously. It's the fault of the entire system that prevents them from doing so. So I think that's also another human technical issue that prevents solar from being, spread across the world. And then I'll jump to my last point with this, but in terms of human resource as well, like, there's so much interest in solar and there's so much interest in climate, but I think the solar industry is a bit hard to break into. I had to go through an entire fellowship that's specifically about people of color to get me into clean energy. And I think that there's a lot of there's that sort of barrier in itself of technical work. Like, I didn't have an engineering degree, I didn't have a STEM degree. And so for me as a candidate, I would look differently in comparison to other people who have that experience, but also just socially, we have to be honest, the clean energy industry as a whole is very, very white, very, very male, very, very affluent. And so for people who, you know, may not have those attributes or qualities, it's something that is definitely a bit of a barrier. And I would say like that goes beyond kind of the technical, but also just like as people who work in the industry, it's definitely up to us to change it and be more open and inclusive and welcome people in, because if people want to do the work, they should be able to, and there shouldn't be anything stopping them. So that's my answer.
Ooh, you hit a nerve with that question with all of us. That was great. And amen to everything Cindy just said about bringing people into the industry too. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, same. Nothing more to add. That's perfectly put, Cindy.
Thanks, everyone. I'm glad we all agree.
Definitely. What started with a question, curious to talk about the technical aspect of solar, kind of led to such a huge conversation talking about like the fossil fuel industry and policies like the investment tax credit, and even talking about equity issues. I feel like we've talked a lot about equity so far today. And I was wondering if you all had any more to say about how equity has come up in the work that you all do, or if there's any challenges when it comes to equity in your work.
Yeah, the one thing that I'll mention, and I'm sure Cindy and Dakota have a good perspective on this too, but about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, Soul Systems as a company changed our mission from simply just wanting to, you know, build as much solar as possible, to being a company that is focused both on the infrastructure of solar, building solar projects, but also the impact. And those two words combined together, infrastructure and impact, are exactly what we try to pursue with every single project that we do. And that has a lot of different meanings, frankly, in terms of what impact is and how it can be applied to a single project. It's, you know, as small as a project that we're doing in Norfolk, Nebraska. Our project is funding 3 scholarships at the local community college for underprivileged people to participate in that program, in their wind energy and solar energy specific program, so that they can enter into the industry that way and provide a pathway, all the way up through a partnership that we have with Microsoft for, you know, 400 or 500 megawatts of projects where there is a specific fund being set aside for impact initiatives. And that goes from, you know, siting projects in locations where we can have a community impact to, you know, funding various organizations that are doing some of the impact and environmental justice work, you know, to, again, those scholarships. So I would say equity has become a huge component of, you know, what our industry is focusing on, and Soul has taken that a step further to sort of make that commitment to apply impact to all of the projects that we're doing too.
Yeah, I'll jump in here too, because I just wanted to kind of combine the themes that Anna just brought up with what Cindy was talking about earlier, like especially within the energy tech, clean tech sector. I'd say that you know, the alignment to impact is very important, and one that I feel like can very easily escape you if you're not super focused on it, like Soul Systems is. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of different, you know, very well-meaning initiatives, policies, like sources of funding that are scattered, you know, around the country and around the globe. But not all of them necessarily make impact where it's like meant to be. Like a lot of funding, I would say, for solar plus, you know, storage projects or, you know, wind, etc., actually go to communities who are, and, you know, organizations that are really prepared to take advantage of it, which usually means like, you know, larger corporates, people with a bunch of money to spend on analysts and like figuring out policy and like writing the applications and, you know, getting interconnection stuff figured out. And those aren't necessarily the people that we always want to help with, you know, renewable energy, right? Like the idea, I think, for the clean energy sector, I think, as Cindy said earlier, is to provide clean, renewable, and cheap energy access for as many people as we can and do it consistently, right? And yeah, it's, for some policies, they're just not written maybe narrowly enough, or, there aren't as many stipulations or not enough enforcement to make sure that the projects that say would benefit the largest amount of people or have the most social impact get in. And so I think that comes from a number of different places, but, this also ties back to like the pipeline of, who gets to write the policy, who gets to design the systems, and the fact that, yeah, up until this point, it has been very predominantly white and male, and, maybe not focus on the communities where it could really provide a lot of benefit. And so, it starts systemically, but then also, I think, those equity issues that we might see in our industry and that we're attempting to tackle now result from that initial systemic inequality. And yeah, and in addition to that, I think it's just, there are also equity issues even all the way up the supply chain. Like for energy storage, we kind of have not only a supply chain issue where lithium costs a lot, but if you think about how lithium is produced, it's produced in, some very poor, like, unable to vouch for themselves, like areas of the world where, I'm sure the miners who are mining lithium don't have much control over, their work-life balance output, like the environmental hazards they face. And even though that's something that we don't talk about as much in the tech sector and, when building all this hardware, it's definitely something that exists and that we'll need to keep track of. And, as energy storage systems and solar burns out, like you have to find out what to do with the waste, right? And that's something that the industry, I think, is now going to start thinking about in the next few years, but we're just starting to hit the life cycle end of a lot of that old technology, right? And that old hardware. So there are many things happening, a lot of equity issues, honestly, but like ones that, at least like, RMI and Soul Systems and Jelly are trying to keep track of and figure out how to deal with as they come up. So yeah, Cindy, go for it.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I feel like I said a lot of my equity piece in terms of the last question, but Dakota, I totally hear you and agree with you on that last point of like, even though solar presents is much better, obviously, than alternative, which is fossil fuels and, a bad, dirty energy system, there are still issues inherent with any type of, production for or some type of technology that is supposed to benefit a large number of people. And I think, you hit the nail on the head saying like, there are equity issues in terms of people who make or are on the manufacturing, people who are installing, who is even creating all the policies and the strategic initiatives of all the different parts of the solar industry. I think that's a really huge point. But I also think this also, at least something that drives me, no matter how hard the work is that like we are at such a pivotal point to completely change how we go about things. I think solar presents a really, especially distributed generation, like it presents a really amazing way for us to change how we've been doing things before so that we aren't as extractive. We aren't oppressing people. We aren't, we actually are creating a better quality of life for all. And I think part of that is addressing all the different inequities that come with this type of process, and then all the different inequities that have, historically existed as well. So I'll end there.
Thanks, all of you, for providing that context. I'm glad that equity has come up as often as it did, because it's definitely an issue. It's honestly not an issue that's new to it's new to the industry or is unique to the solar industry, but it's definitely something that should be tackled everywhere. And Cindy, you mentioned distributed generation, and so that easily leads into my next question. And to provide a little bit of context, when I was working in the legislature back home in Guam, there was a huge debate in the community about the difference between solar farms and distributed generation. And in that context, it kind of felt like it was an either or thing and from the policy perspective. So I kind of wanted, since I have you all here, to kind of ask you all your thoughts on solar farms versus distributed generation. Is it one or the other? Is this a debate? Do they both come with advantages and disadvantages, and what you all would suggest to policymakers on that issue.
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one first because it's my day to day. It's what I focus on. I would say that it has to be an all of the above approach. There is a place for distributed generation, siting projects directly where the load exists, you know, rooftops, carports, even ground mount systems next to large facilities. I personally think that's incredibly critical to be able to address the needs of customers and help to build out solar in the way that it can be. I personally am an advocate of putting solar in places where it can be an accessory use, or, you know, we're utilizing land that's not going to be used for anything else. But as much as I love that type of work, I also acknowledge that, you know, these other, you know, community solar or, you know, virtual solar type projects need to exist in order to achieve the scale that we, you know, likely need to achieve to make an impact. And it's also an access issue too. You know, not every single person has a rooftop that's perfect for solar, or, you know, maybe energy rates are so low in a certain area that carport systems just don't even make sense because they're so expensive. But everyone deserves access to that clean energy. And so these larger, you know, virtual community solar type projects, you know, do serve a purpose in that sort of situation, and frankly helps to drive down costs and ensure that, you know, pricing can be competitive. So I think there is room for both. But unfortunately, what tends to happen, especially in state legislatures, is that there's a strong lobby for one or the other. And there aren't a lot of states that have been able to structure policies in a way to truly promote both. Maine is a pretty perfect example of that. In 2019, the legislation that was passed to expand the net energy billing program was a huge driver to all the solar that's been built in the state. And it did technically, you know, allow for both distributed generation and these virtual projects. But naturally what happened was, you know, there was a huge land grab, and a lot of those larger community solar projects were the first ones to hit the market. They were going to have the lowest pricing. And so that is what became most attractive to customers. And I'll never want to argue against cheap solar, but at the same time, those projects have caused significant issues on the interconnection side, you know, permitting and development side that have held back the industry in some ways. And there's still a huge opportunity for that, you know, on-site, truly distributed generation behind the meter solar. And so although the legislation allows for it, there are dynamics within the market that drive stakeholders to go in one direction or the other. And so one thing that we've been encouraging various working groups across Maine to consider is additional incentives for that on-site generation so that both types of project opportunities can be addressed in the state. Unfortunately, it's a state-by-state issue at this point. And I don't think we're going to get anything federal anytime soon, which would be nice. But yeah, I'll get off my soapbox. That's my perspective.
No, thanks, Anna. That helps me because I do acknowledge that when I was in the Guam legislature, there definitely was two lobbying fronts: the individual home solar lobbying front, and then the large solar farm lobbying front. So that definitely brings out the context that it's not really an either or issue, it's a lobbying issue. But yeah, Cindy and Dakota, feel free to add if you all have anything.
I can jump in. Yeah, I think it's a super interesting question because it also points out like that's the cool and innovative thing about solar, right? You can either have solar farms, or you can literally just put some rooftop systems up and create like a virtual power plant, or aggregate the power, aggregate the infrastructure together. And I think that is one of the reasons why solar is sort of the future, it's the innovation. But it also, kind of echoing Anna's point, it also depends on the purpose and kind of the place that you're in, right? Like, so specifically, I always talk about the islands context, because that's where I work, but islands are extremely space constrained. Like, there may not be adequate space to build a solar farm. So maybe the best approach is to build a bunch of rooftop systems and then have that virtual power plant approach. And I think it's also, it depends on the sense of urgency. So in terms of putting distributed generation in islands, one of the biggest things we need to do is kind of increase renewable uptake, but also do it in a way that what we call the soft energy pathway. It's not just like transitioning to renewables like immediately. It's like increasing the uptake of renewables so that, with the technical issues of the system that can be adjusted, but also just so that it shows like the market benefit of it. And then so eventually the system can be renewables based. And I think also, like I mentioned, with kind of the resilience aspect earlier, distributed generation is important, because when you have a bunch of different kind of systems, and obviously it depends on how much power is being generated, you have the opportunity for systems in case of an event of a disaster to be able to bounce back quicker. And I think one of the cool things about distributed generation, and you can do this with solar farms as well, is just the kind of community aspect of it, right? Like I said, like people-centered solutions are super important. And one of the ways to get people on board is to show them like, hey, like if we put it on your rooftop, or if we put it right next to you, like look at the benefits it's creating. And obviously there's like policy implications to that, as Anna mentioned, with like net billing and now net energy metering and stuff. But I'll stop there. I just think it's an interesting question, because it's just an innovative thing. And I think the most important point is figure out what can get more people onto clean energy faster.
Yep, I think that's correct. And to echo Anna and Cindy's points, like I think it is a kind of all of the above approach depending on the situation. Like that's just how it goes. And you can even think about it climatically, right? Like somewhere, in the northeast of the US is going to get a lot less solar radiation than the southwest and such. But I think, my blanket statement and coverage for this is just like, if you attach storage to everything, it becomes less of an issue, like, whether the distribution, the generation is distributed or centralized in one place, and makes it much easier to control. So I don't know, I think the kind of debate is important only if you feel like you're running out of funding to give both, right? And that I think also kind of runs up to policy politics, like how much funding does the solar industry get, et cetera, and how much do the technologies or other industries that support solar get, and how are those being pushed along? So definitely multifaceted, but yeah, you really can't do like a one or the other approach realistically. Like maybe for each locale, like they decide what's best for them, but you need both to, I think, truly replace fossil fuels for like the base energy load for the US or anywhere else.
I just wanted to clarify, Dakota, when you say attach storage to everything, do you mean attach storage to like rooftop solar and also keep it on the grid?
Yeah, I'd say so. If you build like a large solar farm and you are able to say store all of that energy in like utility scale batteries or utility size batteries that kind of are close to the output of the solar, like you can just store that energy for whenever you need it, right? Like if you are say going to turn on a gas-fired power plant, but you have a bunch of solar energy stored in batteries, you can discharge that energy instead of turning on a gas-fired peaker plant. And then for homes, it's like a different set of equations and probably like smaller scale. But it's like a similar logic, right? Like if you have energy stored up from the solar array on your roof, you can use that at different times of the day where maybe you have the TV on and like your oven, microwave, et cetera, when the sun isn't shining, and that displaces that load or that need for potentially dirty energy, because you have everything located right there. There's differences with all of the, I think, steps needed to do installation, permitting, etc. But all things equal, like storage helps in, I think, in many cases. So
yeah, thanks all of you for your perspective. And I think Cindy, Anna, you all helped answer my questions, but Anna, you talked a little bit about the lobbying effort, and Cindy's talking about the island context and the issue of space was definitely something I heard back home in Guam, where coming from a small island, space is the issue with solar farms. But yeah, thanks for humoring me on that question. And now I will give you all another soapbox to policymakers. If you all had to talk to policymakers, federal policymakers, what policies, and you got to tell them what policies you think are needed from them to help you all expand the solar industry. We kind of talked a little bit about it so far, but if I'd love to give you all another soapbox, just if you had anything else to add.
I can jump in first. I probably, out of all of us, maybe don't have the most experience with this, even though I was a policy major. But some of the things that came to mind for me when I saw this question is, first off, what type of policies can we, promote or pass to incentivize people to get on solar? And the first thing is obviously like net energy metering and now net energy metering. And I don't know, I guess maybe for background, net energy metering policies are essentially just like when you have a rooftop system, whatever energy you generate that's in excess, you can export it back to the grid and get paid for it. Essentially, it depends on the jurisdiction that you're in. And I would say those are key because that we've seen it in the past in a lot of different states that's like once those policies came into place and once, kind of the market and the social attitudes towards solar all clicked in, rooftop solar systems and the amount of solar customers kind of just shot up for utilities. So I would say that is a big policy, but also with the caveat and the provision that those types of policies also need to consider non-solar customers so that the cost of, or the avoided cost of solar, which is the cost of the utility, kind of saves by not serving the person that's on solar because they're generating their own electricity. That doesn't get passed on to people who don't have their own solar systems. And typically, like Dakota had mentioned earlier, people who get solar are, people with resources and the time to put the money up front, go through the interconnection process and permitting process, things like that. So it's really important for those types of policies and for policymakers and utilities to understand, like, how do we still provide benefit to our other customers who are not solar customers in passing those. And then I would say two other policies that are a bit more, if you can categorize them as more theoretical rather than kind of that implementation focus as net energy metering, is first, just like building active stating active commitments. So for example, within the islands, in terms of, a lot of countries develop their NDCs or nationally determined contributions that they report to the UNFCCC of like, this is what we're going to do about climate in terms of our action. And a lot of countries will say like, okay, we're going to buy X number of years, say 2050, we're going to have 50% or 75% of our energy mix be renewables. And, even though that sounds like just like a kind of statement out there, it actually is important in putting down the commitment that you will get there. And therefore you have like an end goal, and a lot of countries hold themselves to it. And so they have to figure out the active steps in order to take so that you can get up to 75%. And I think like that's important to translate into all the different types of contexts, even the US context, even in US cities, right? Like having these types of really big, bold, actionable commitments is something that is really important and is good policy. And then the second is just getting investments especially in vulnerable countries, carrying out integrated resource and resilient planning. So these are essentially kind of, they turn into energy policies, but essentially what it is the process for countries to kind of sit down and develop a bunch of different scenarios related to their energy mix. So you have like, your base case, what's business as usual, what's happening now, all the way up to like a really high renewables penetration, mid renewables penetration, and what does that look like for your energy future? How many customers does that power? Does that meet demand, projected demand into the future? But also, what is that going to cost? That's something that's we do a lot within the islands team, at least for a lot of different islands, to help them figure out and show them the market case that like, look, actually, when you have high renewables penetration, yes, the cost is high up front, but in the long run, you're going to be able to serve so many more customers. You're going to save so much more money. And in terms of the resilience metrics that we put down, it's going to be a bit more of a resilient system. So I'd say those are the three policies that I would try and convince policymakers to get on board with.
Thanks, Cindy. And like, I think it's great that you mentioned nationally determined contributions, because in COP26 last year, they had encouraged a lot of different countries or everyone in the Paris Agreement to, even though that the contributions were renewed in 26, to renew again in 27 to become even more ambitious. And that's including even the US. The US has an opportunity to go more ambitious in those contributions. So it's great that you brought that up, and hopefully we see more ambitious contributions at COP27. But Anna and Dakota, feel free to add.
I honestly don't have much more to add to that, other than to emphasize the net energy metering, I think, is a huge component, at least for the work that we do at Soul Systems, and creating consistent policy for that across various states and jurisdictions, I think would be tremendously powerful, just to make the process more efficient. The other one that I'll flag, similar to what I said earlier, but just extending the investment tax credit for a more significant period of time. I know that's obviously US focused, but will be a big driver of the work that we do here. And then, similar to what Cindy was saying too, but like creating accountability, and whether that's in the form of a carbon tax or more renewable portfolio standards or whatever that might look like. If we aren't going to get the funding through an investment tax credit or through, more supportive policies like net energy metering, it would be helpful to put out a stick, instead of a bunch of carrots. And so, some sort of dynamic there that enables and pushes customers to be thinking more critically about this type of technology and about renewables in general.
Yeah, and since I think Anna and Cindy kind of labeled all the very practical policy changes, I'll just throw out some wish list ones. Like the price of carbon, definitely like punitive maybe, but obviously, is a bit of an Aikido move for the fossil fuel industry. Taking away the fossil fuel industry's subsidies and, whatever Biden was spouting the other week about penalizing oil companies for not producing, stuff like that, out. And then honestly, I think also on the education side, actually, as referenced before, like there's kind of a lack of pipeline for folks to get into the clean energy space, both at the collegiate level, even though that's improving through, I think, a lot of, efforts. I think Anna talked about some of that from the Soul Systems perspective, and then, the various nonprofits and stuff that push for that. But, at the, let's say elementary through high school level, like how much climate education do people get? Like how much knowledge about the grid or the energy sources do they get? Probably close to zero, if any, right? And even the average adult, there's some statistics in that the average adult looks at their energy bill 5 minutes out of every year or something like that. And, that's not really conducive to getting people excited about solar, having people understand the benefits of it and pushing it forward in a public mindset. So having more education and more resources there, whether it be in the form of formalized programming or just at least funding for schools to teach it and structure their own programs, would be super helpful as well. But I really like carbon pricing too. It might be a bit late for that now, given everything that's happened, but I still think the idea of doing a quick little judo move on the oil industry would be maybe satisfying, at least, and maybe it would definitely push for the solar industry and other renewables as well. So
yeah, well, thanks all for sharing that, and hopefully we can take all those ideas, write them down, send them to Congress right now, and hopefully get them passed in the next week and change the world. But until then, we got to work on, like Dakota said, trying to figure out ways to increase this pipeline for youth to kind of get into the solar industry and get into this field. So I was hoping, and if anyone has questions this is the last question. So if anyone has questions, feel free to send them in the Q&A feature. If you all had something to say to young people who are interested in getting into this industry, what would you tell them?
talk to as many different people as possible. I think that's, if you have the opportunity to network, take advantage of that. I think to one of the points that was said earlier, there's not a lot of access to the industry unless you have, you know, a specific technical degree or finance or something along those lines. And so part of what I try to do when I talk to people that are looking to get into the industry is just like educate them on the various opportunities that exist in the industry. I mean, the four of us here are all in the industry, but work for very different groups. So there's a lot of different opportunity. And so the more people you can talk to, I think the better. And the other side of it too is it's kind of on us as companies to be putting our names out there, not just talking to the best colleges and universities in the country, but you know, be reaching out to community colleges, to HBCUs, to, you know, various other groups to make sure that, you know, we're putting out the message too, and enabling folks to be able to network with a company like ours, and with the people that work at our company too.
Yeah, I can jump in really quick and say that just thinking back to, I guess, my own journey to get into the energy industry, the highest barrier to entry, I think, currently is like industry knowledge. Because, you know, I think as Anna was saying, there are many, many skill sets that can be put to use in the solar industry and the energy industry at large. But, you know, even thinking to interviews I've been doing over the past month or two, the most consistent question or reason why we might not hire someone is because they don't have knowledge of the industry, which is a bit of a catch-22 if you're starting out, right? Because how would you know what's important to the industry if you've never worked in it? And, you know, the options to learn more about the industry are growing. Obviously, this is one definitely great resource you could use, but I would say, you know, like go to like classes. I feel like undergraduate classes, if my memory serves me great, unless you have programs directly focused on clean energy and solar, aren't as helpful either. But yeah, just like take the time to research different energy companies, and like, you know, maybe they don't have a job for you right at the bat, maybe they don't have like an internship for you, but if you just go and find someone at some level who's willing to talk about their work, that's a really great way to like get that industry knowledge. And almost every person in the energy industry, whether they're in like private, you know, government, nonprofit, loves talking about their work. Energy people are such huge nerds. So if like you can get a hold of one for like an hour or two, like it'll definitely, you know, bump you up a few levels in industry knowledge. And yeah, just, you know, there's plenty of people out there at this point. So just, you know, get on Google, find your favorite local company, and actually just give them a cold email. You know, you need to ask for a job, just ask them like, what do you do? And try and start that conversation. And I think it will be some form of fruitful, hopefully. So
yeah, I definitely echo what you, Dakota, and you, Anna, said about just like the importance of networking. I think that goes for any type of job or any type of industry. Like the more people you know, the better. It's not necessarily, I think it's also a mindset shift, right? It's like, maybe you will talk to the person that's going to get you that job, but the odds are you probably are not. Maybe they don't have the power to get you a job, but the more connections and the more knowledge you build and the more kind of like you get your name out there, it's definitely a plus for you as an applicant. And I would just like, you know, stepping back a few points, it's like the thing that sucks so much, like Dakota mentioned, is that like there's such a huge leap from undergraduate education or even graduate education to like actually working within the industry itself, especially if you want to go to the more technical side of it. It's just like, it's a really big leap and you have a lot to learn. But I think that one of the things that I learned throughout my job search was just being open to different opportunities. Like maybe you don't, if you want to work in solar and you want to work in the industry, maybe that's not your first job. Like, for example, for me, like, I wanted to work at a big green nonprofit doing advocacy work, and that certainly was not my job. I'm doing quite the opposite, working in an international think tank doing energy work, and it's great. And but it's opening different doors for me down the line in the future. And I would just encourage, you know, if you are in the job application process, if you're a senior in college, senior in graduate school, whatever, you're finishing your graduate program or just looking for a new job, I think the most important thing is just being open to different opportunities and open to kind of different scopes of work, whether it's like something you never imagined yourself in or something you were like, yeah, like tangentially I could have done that as well. I think like one of the great things about being an early career professional is like you get to try so many things, right? And like, you know, the great thing right now is it's kind of a worker's environment. So you get to advocate for yourself as well if something isn't right for you, whether it's advocating within your workplace or just being like, you know, I'm going to seek a new opportunity. And I know I hated getting this advice when I was in the job application process, and just talk to people. But it's the reason people say that is because it's the only thing that kind of works. Like, you can sit down and apply to hundreds of jobs, but at the end of the day, like if you aren't willing to accept something or you don't talk to people and actually get a really good handle on like what type of different careers entail, you might be stuck in a different position later on. So I would just say like just be really, really open. And then there's also, for example, plug for the Ray Fellowship. There's also certain pipeline programs. So the Ray Fellowship being one of them. If you're interested in applying, please feel free to reach out. It's something that I've greatly benefited from, and I wouldn't have been able to start my career otherwise, in my opinion. And also, like, it's changed how I look at my career development specifically. So I would just say be really, really open. And energy isn't, like, the good thing about it is energy is an industry that's rapidly growing. I didn't have any energy classes in undergrad, nor did any of my peers at Colby. And I know so many people now who just happen to work in energy because they're like, anyone who has some environmental knowledge, like, we want you, we need you, because you can do at least some of the work and we'll teach you. So yeah, just be open, for sure.
Well, thank you all for participating in this panel. I think this is a great discussion. And we're thankful to everyone who attended. And this, like I said earlier, this webinar will also be available on our YouTube page. So to those of you who might be watching on YouTube, if you're interested in getting in contact with any of our panelists, feel free to reach out to me and I can send you their contact information at javan that's JAVAN at theclimateinitiative.org. And yeah, thank you for a wonderful discussion. This has been really fun, and enjoy the rest of your evening or day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.